Children of the Stones by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray. Chapter 2. So this was their new landlord. Matthew had watched his father make out a check to R. Hendrick, Esquire, for £240, 3 months' rent in advance. And he had pictured some doddering old colonel trying to make ends meet by letting his cottages for the summer. But this man didn't dodder. He stood straight as a ramrod. The stranger seemed pleasant enough, but his dark eyes were without warmth. They darted quickly from side to side, taking everything in, yet giving nothing away. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking. He didn't appear to be annoyed that the teapot had been smashed to pieces and that a dark stain was spreading over the carpet. He put his hand gently on Mrs. Crabtree's shoulder. "Mary?" Her eyes snapped open, and she stared up at him blankly. Hendrick's voice took on a sharper edge. "Mary, another pot of tea, if you please." "Yes, sir. Happy day, sir." Snapping out of her trance, she stood up and bustled back into the kitchen. Adam started picking up the broken pieces of china. "I'll pay for the damage. We gave her a bit of a shock. Poor woman." Hendrick looked surprised. "Shock? Well, it is rather macabre." Adam threw the fragments into the waste paper basket, crossed over to the picture, and held it up. For a long moment, Hendrick remained absolutely still. Then he walked slowly over to the painting and peered closely at it, examining every detail. "Where did you get this?" "My son found it." "Where?" "In a junk shop." Hendrick turned and looked thoughtfully at Matthew. Matthew shifted uncomfortably from one leg to the other, feeling the black eyes boring into him. They were like radar scanners trying to probe an unidentified object. Then, unexpectedly, Hendrick smiled. "Your name, young man?" "Matthew." "You bought this picture?" "Yes." "Why?" Matthew swallowed nervously. "It looked just like the photographs. Of the village, I mean." "Strange that you should happen to see it." The voice was soft, but the statement sounded like an accusation. Matthew felt a further explanation was necessary. "It was in the window of this little shop. I couldn't see half of it because it was hidden by an old candlestick, but it was only 50p, so I went inside and asked if I could look at it."
"Did the shopkeeper tell you where he got it?"
"He said he got most of his stuff from country houses, but he couldn't remember which one it came from." Adam had turned the picture around and was studying it with interest. "The resemblance to Milbury is certainly remarkable," he said. "The circle must have looked very much like this when it was first erected." Hendrick moved to stand by his side. "The people appear to be running away from that bright light in the center. Like a primitive tribe running away from an eclipse." "Yes. An ancient pagan ceremony, perhaps. They could have conjured up some sort of apparition, and then found they'd bitten off more than they could chew." Adam smiled. "From ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. Good Lord deliver us." Hendrick stared at him.
"What on earth's that?"
"It's an old Cornish litany. When I was a boy, my mother hung it on the wall above my bed. I used to think it was very sinister, and as a matter of fact, I still do." Hendrick bent down to examine the picture again. "There's an inscription at the bottom," he said. "I can't see it without my glasses. What does it say?" "I've learned it by heart," said Matthew. "It's in Latin, and it says, 'Quod non est simulo, dissum loque, quod est.'" Hendrik looked impressed.
Can you translate it?
Dad told me what it means. It's something like, I deny the existence of that which exists.
Really? A rather futile statement, don't you think?
Matthew had already come to the same conclusion. It's pretty stupid, he agreed. Mrs. Crabtree appeared with a fresh pot of tea. She looked very shamefaced and glanced apologetically at Hendrik as if begging his forgiveness for her lack of self-control. But Hendrik didn't seem to notice.
Ah, he said, rubbing his hands. Tea at last. You don't mind if I join you?
Adam indicated a chair. Please, he said. Everything we have is yours. They sat down, and the two men chatted on while Matthew lit into the food with gusto. He had to admit that Mrs. Crabtree was an excellent cook. The chocolate cake was delicious. Hendrik sipped his tea, regarding Adam's electronic equipment with a professional eye.
Oscillator, oscilloscope, magnetometer, expensive toys.
They're not mine, Adam told him. They're borrowed from the university.
You'll be going back then? When your 3 months are up?
Oh, yes.
Ever thought of settling down in a place like this?
I've thought of it, but I can't afford to retire yet a while. I've a growing boy to feed, and you can see how much he eats. Matthew, his cheeks bulging with cake, felt embarrassed. He knew his father was joking, but did Hendrik know it? Their visitor didn't seem to be the sort of man who appreciated jokes. He swallowed quickly, choked, and felt even more embarrassed when a fit of coughing made him turn away from the table. Hendrik made no comment. He turned back to Adam.
Forgive my curiosity, he said. But your wife?
She died, said Adam, 2 years ago.
I'm sorry.
I have Matthew. Despite his voracious appetite, he's a great consolation. Matthew began to feel better. To be described as a consolation, even a greedy one, was confirmation that his father needed him. He didn't care what Hendrik thought of him now. Defiantly, he helped himself to another piece of cake. Hendrik watched him impassively.
And a future astrophysicist?
Adam shrugged. Possibly. He seems to have inherited a great deal of my... He hesitated. Hendrik smiled.
Talent?
Enthusiasm.
You're too modest. I read your paper on the residual magnetism of megalithic stone. A very impressive piece of work.
Adam looked surprised. You'd heard of me then? Before I answered your advertisement.
Heard of you? Of course I've heard of you. Anyone with the faintest interest in astrophysics has heard of Adam Brake.
Adam poured himself another cup of tea. And you have more than a faint interest?
I dabble. You know. Inside this circle, it's difficult not to speculate.
I can imagine. Adam turned to Matthew. Finished? Yes. Then why don't you go out and explore? Get your bearings. Matthew hesitated. He didn't particularly want to go exploring without his father. It had seemed a perfectly ordinary village, apart from the stones, and to understand their significance he needed Adam's expert knowledge. Hendrik misinterpreted his reluctance.
The locals don't bite, you know. Everyone's very friendly here. I'm sure you'll find someone to show you around.
He spoke with such confidence that Matthew suddenly felt certain this wasn't a guess. It was almost as if the big man knew who that someone would be. But whether he knew it or not, he was right. A well-built boy of about Matthew's age was waiting by the garden gate, munching on an apple. His bicycle was propped up against the fence. Matthew walked down slowly to the path toward him. "Hello," he said. "Happy day," said the boy cheerfully. Again, the strange greeting. Matthew couldn't understand why it made him so uncomfortable. After all, it was perfectly natural to wish someone happiness. He opened the gate. Matthew. Bob, said the boy. He held out his apple. Like a bite? No thanks, I've just had tea. Right, off we go then. I haven't got a bike. Bob pointed to a shed next to the cottage. There's one in there. Matthew opened the shed door and found a shiny new bike propped up against one of the walls. He wheeled it down the garden path and climbed on. It was just his size. Bob watched him expressionlessly. Okay? Fine. Good. He climbed onto his own bike and cycled down off the road. Matthew had to pedal hard to catch up with him. Where are we going? He asked. I don't know. Fancy an ice cream? I haven't any money. I have. We'll stop at the post office. They turned left down a narrow passage between two houses. Some distance ahead was the girl Matthew had spoken to outside the cottage. She was wandering along, swinging her satchel, and didn't appear to hear them until Bob rang his bell. Then she jumped to one side like a startled rabbit, flattening herself against the wall as they cycled past. Matthew noticed that she completely ignored Bob. He himself seemed to be the object of her attention, and when he glanced back, she was still gazing solemnly at him. He remembered her parting words. We have to stick together, she had told him. An odd, disturbing thing to say. Who's that? He asked Bob when they had turned another corner. Name's Sandra. Her mum looks after the museum. She stares a lot. Yes. Something the matter with her? Not that I know of. She'll feel better when she's a happy one. What's a happy one? Someone who's happy, of course. Matthew began to feel annoyed. Everyone in the village seemed to talk in riddles as if they shared a secret from which he was being excluded. Well, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of letting them see how frustrated he was. He would play it cool until they decided to accept him. They reached the post office and dismounted, leaning their bicycles against the wall. Bob went in, and Matthew was about to follow when he happened to glance up at a small hill just outside the stone circle. A man was standing motionless on the hilltop, silhouetted against the evening sky. As Matthew watched, he raised a long, thin object to his head and pointed it straight at the post office. There was a glint of silver as the object caught the sun's rays, and it was suddenly possible to see it more clearly. It was a telescope. It was bad enough to be stared at by the girl, but to be scrutinized by a man with a telescope was too much. Matthew hurried inside, feeling more and more bad-tempered. If only the people around here would mind their own business. The post office was more of a village shop. True, there was a small counter at the back with a sign saying stamps and postal orders, but most of the space was taken up with boxes of fruit and vegetables, and the shelves were packed with tins of food. There was a freezer in the corner from which Bob was helping himself to 2 pops. The postmistress stood by his side, beaming at him. She was a small bird-like creature with enormous eyes that were magnified by a pair of thick, rimless spectacles. That'll be 12p, Bob, she was saying. Sure you can afford it? You don't get your pocket money till tomorrow. Bob handed her the money. Still got some left from my birthday, Mrs. Warner. Good boy. It pays to be thrifty, doesn't it? She turned and moved toward the till, then stopped as she saw Matthew. The huge eyes blinked at him through the glasses. This must be your new friend you were telling me about. Yes. Bob handed Matthew one of the pops, and they both started to unwrap them. Mrs. Warner opened up the till. It's nice to make new friends, she said. Old friends are all very well, but it's nice to make new ones. It broadens one's horizon. Yes, said Bob. I'm just showing him around. Well, happy day, boys. Enjoy yourselves. Matthew followed Bob outside. As he shut the door, he could see Mrs. Warner beaming at him from behind the counter. They retrieved their bikes and wheeled them into the road, sucking their pops. "Why do you all say that?" asked Matthew. "What?" "Happy day." Bob shrugged. "We just like people to be happy." "Anything wrong with that?" He ran several paces, threw himself over the crossbar, and cycled down off the street. Matthew was about to follow when he suddenly remembered the watcher on the hilltop. He turned and squinted up toward the setting sun. The man was still there, still holding the telescope to his eye, not for the first time since he came to the village. Matthew felt vaguely uneasy. He threw his pop into a trash can, climbed onto his bike, and pedaled away as fast as he could. He turned a corner and saw that Bob was far ahead, racing toward the crossroads at the center of the village. Matthew called to him, but he took no notice, standing up on the pedals to get more speed. In the distance, from the direction of the avenue, came the sound of an approaching truck, thundering toward the crossroads. Matthew slowed down, expecting Bob to do the same, but his companion didn't seem to be aware of the danger. Matthew shouted a warning, but it went unheeded. Bob was pedaling furiously toward the main road, and now the truck came into view, roaring down the avenue like a huge black animal. Surely Bob could hear it now. The noise was deafening, but still he hurtled on, and Matthew realized with horror that if neither of them slowed down, the bike and the truck would reach the crossroads at exactly the same time. They were on a certain collision course. He stopped and cried out in alarm, but the roar of the truck's engine was now too great. He couldn't even hear his own voice. He covered his eyes, unable to watch the inevitable accident. He heard the crashing of the air brakes, the baying of a car horn. Then silence. All sound suddenly stopped, as if a television control had been switched off. Slowly, he forced himself to open his eyes, expecting to see the wreck of the bike and the mangled body of its owner. But there was Bob, cycling around and around in the middle of the road as if nothing had happened. "Come on," he called impatiently. "What have you stopped for?" "The truck. What happened to the truck?" "What truck?" "You must have seen it. It was coming straight at you." "If something was coming straight at me, I'd have gotten out of the way, wouldn't I?" There was no answer to that. Matthew remounted his bike and cycled slowly up to the main road. He could see a couple of miles in both directions, and it was completely empty, its surface shimmering in the heat. Could he have imagined the truck? No, of course not. The crashing of its brakes still echoed in his ears. Then how could it have disappeared? And why was Bob pretending that he hadn't heard it? It was all extremely puzzling. Adam, meanwhile, was strolling across the village green with Hendrik. They were making for the pub where Hendrik had offered to introduce his new tenant to some of the locals. Adam had eagerly accepted the offer. It was a long time since he had a drink in a real old country pub, and the contacts he made there might prove useful. Hendrik hesitated by the door. "You know, it really is an extraordinary coincidence," he said thoughtfully. "What?" "Your son, coming across that picture." "Yes. Bit of luck, wasn't it?" Hendrik frowned. "Luck?" "That he got it so cheap." "Oh, yes, I suppose it was." He pushed open the door and led the way into the pub. There was only one bar, a long oak-beamed room with several alcoves leading off it. Adam noted with distaste that there was a jukebox in a corner, but the place was bright and cheerful, and it had its compensations. Not least among these was an attractive woman who sat alone in one of the alcoves. She had red hair and wore a smart green pantsuit, which looked as if it had been specifically designed for her. She sat perfectly still, playing with the half-empty glass on the table in front of her, and taking no notice of the group of men who were chatting by the bar. Adam guessed she was in her early 30s. He hadn't looked at another woman since his wife had died. But this one interested him. Her beautifully sculptured face might have been carved out of marble, and he wondered what she was thinking. She hadn't taken her eyes off the glass since they came in. There was no sign of a male companion, but Adam took it for granted that she was married. Surely she must have been snapped up by now. He glanced at the third finger of her left hand. Yes. There was an expensive-looking emerald ring on it. Just his luck. Adam grabbed him by the elbow and propelled him to the bar. The landlord, a big bald man with huge forearms, moved to serve them. "Evening, Mr. Hendrick. The usual?" "Yes, please, George. And I've brought you a new customer." The landlord gave Adam a friendly smile. "Oh?" "This is Mr. Brake. He's renting my cottage for 3 months." The landlord wiped his hand with a cloth and held it out. "Happy day to you, sir. A hard-drinking man, I hope?" "I like whiskey, if that's what you mean," said Adam, shaking hands. "Large or small?" "Large," said Hendrick. "It's my round." While the landlord was fetching the drinks, Adam glanced back at the solitary woman. "Who's that?" he asked. Hendrick turned and contemplated her approvingly. "Attractive, isn't she? Name's Margaret Smythe. Another new arrival. A summer visitor? No, she's come to work here. She's curator of the museum. Married? A widow. She has a daughter at the school." Adam's spirits rose. "Is she as lonely as she looks?" Hendrick looked amused. "There's only one way to find out. Follow me." They crossed over to the woman's table. Hendrick put a hand on her shoulder. "Margaret?" She looked around, startled. "Yes." "This is Adam Brake. Poor chap doesn't know anyone in the village. Wants to be taken under your wing." The woman surveyed Adam with cool green eyes. "Why mine?" Hendrick smiled. "I think he likes the look of the feathers." He moved back to the bar, leaving them alone. Adam suddenly felt like an awkward schoolboy. He indicated the bench opposite her. "May I?" "Of course." He sat down, but he was embarrassed to discover he couldn't think of anything to say. The green eyes were appraising him, and he wondered if they liked what they saw. "It is true, you know," he said finally, trying to get some sort of conversation started. "What's true?" "That I want to be taken under your wing. I'm going to need some help." She frowned. "What sort of help?" "I'm a scientist, here to do some research on the stones." "I know." Adam stared at her. "I seem to have a lot of advanced publicity." "A village is a small place, Mr. Brake." "Adam." She nodded, as if she had at last decided to accept him. The invisible barrier between them suddenly seemed to disappear. "I've read everything I can about the circle," he went on, "but nothing to explain why Neolithic man chose to construct it at Millbury. Perhaps you have some theories." She looked down at her glass. "Oh, yes," she said softly. "I've plenty of theories. I'd like to hear them. Come to the museum tomorrow morning. We can talk there." "Right. As a matter of fact, there's one mystery that perhaps you could explain to me." "What's that?" "The fact that Millbury doesn't appear in the Doomsday Book." Adam thought for a minute. "Yes, that is odd. There must have been a thriving community here in 1086. "Exactly." Margaret sipped her drink, but her eyes never left Adam's face. Hendrick loomed above them, carrying 2 glasses, one of which he handed to Adam. "Excuse me, Margaret, but I'd like to borrow Adam back for a moment. I want him to meet Miss Clegg." He turned to reveal a tall, angular woman standing behind him. "Miss Clegg's the schoolteacher," he said to Adam. "I thought you might like to have a word with her about Matthew." Adam got to his feet. "Oh, yes, we've had some correspondence. Nice to meet you, Miss Clegg." Miss Clegg simpered girlishly. "And you, Professor. It will be a privilege to teach the son of such an eminent man." "You may not consider it such a privilege when you hear his French. It's as bad as mine." "Oh, I expect he'll make up for it in the sciences. I hope so. He's pretty advanced for his age." Miss Clegg glanced at Hendrik, and Adam intercepted a look of... what? Triumph? Satisfaction? It was hard to tell. She turned back to him. "When may I expect him?" "Tomorrow. He's already missed 3 days a term. If he misses any more, he'll find it difficult to catch up." Hendrik patted him on the arm. "Tomorrow, then. I'll arrange for someone to show him the way." "Thank you." Adam knew he should be feeling grateful to Hendrik, but for some reason, he resented it. He realized he was being unreasonable. The man obviously meant well, but he couldn't help it. He couldn't help himself. Perhaps he just liked being independent, or perhaps it was that conspiratorial look between Hendrik and Miss Clegg. Why should they have been so pleased to learn that his son was good at science?